Hello everyone and welcome to LR Lesson 3. We'll be covering assumptions, what I call negative space, and my red, blue, purple argument breakdown methodology. So as always, we begin with a hopefully brief overview of what this lesson contains. As I've made passing reference to in some other lessons, pretty much every single LR argument boils down to the following general form. Believe conclusion C because of premise P. From this it follows that the general form of pretty much every assumption is as follows. The arguer assumes that P alone is enough to cover all the relevant issues when it comes to proving C. So easy arguments talk about a distinct idea P in the premises and shift to a different and equally distinct idea C in the conclusion. Obviously, in this case, our assumption has to link P with C somehow. And my silly red, blue, purple, henceforth I'll just shorten it to RBP, approach is just an instructional tool to make these elements more visible. Harder arguments, in contrast, often move from concept P in the premises to concept P plus in the conclusion. The difference between them will be relatively minimal or subtle. What I found over the years is that many people, myself included early on in my training, struggle to prephrase an assumption that links concept P to related concept P plus. It can be difficult to do. I believe that has something to do with the idea that it's hard to try to verbalize a link between something that isn't actually written down anywhere, the empty/nothing that follows the vanilla concept P, to something that is written down, the plus that follows at the end of P plus. Not exactly the most intuitive thing to do for most. So to help handle that situation where we are trying to match a blank space after P to a plus that follows after P, I'm going to borrow the term negative space from the visual arts to describe working with stuff that is not written out when it comes to LR. So in terms of LR, negative space refers to stuff like the empty or nothing that follows the ideas like just the vanilla P concept with no plus, just the vanilla P. This kind of negative space can also come into play for strength and weaken or flaw questions, but the big nice thing about the general form of the assumption that I want to cover here is that it naturally positions you to start thinking about the negative space surrounding what's written down. And finally, some arguments actually shift that P versus C or P versus P plus mismatch not between the classic premises and conclusion mismatch, but between the premises themselves. Breaking down untimed questions using RBP can help train you to recognize when that actually is happening. So this lesson is going to go live pretty much the day before the September 10, 2022 administration of the exam. So in this week running up to that exam, I've been asked a lot for last-minute help with assumptions of all kinds. And so that's why, even though I've covered a certain amount of this in my argument basics lesson, that's LR lesson 02, the spike in requests for help about assumptions drove me to make this separate lesson. So let's go over the basics of assumptions again for the sake of this discussion today. No matter how complicated sounding an LR argument is, it generally boils down to some variation of the familiar format, believe conclusion C because of premise P. So if you see that and you're thinking, such a general formulation of arguments is too general to be of any use on LR, you're actually right. It's way too broad to help. That's not where its value comes from. However, the general form of the assumption that we can pull out from the general form of the argument is way more helpful. And that general form of the assumption is, the arguer assumes that P alone is enough to prove C. Okay, so the next natural question. So how does the arguer assumes that P alone is enough to prove C help us at all? It gives you a safe place from which you can start to think of weakeners, which you can mentally judo into strengtheners, all while not really needing to have a spot-on prephrase of the assumption itself. The general form of the assumption also helps you handle assumption and flaw answer choices that deal with what I'm about to call negative space. So what exactly is negative space? In the visual arts, negative space is the empty space between the stuff that you actually draw. In logic, I'm going to use negative space, and it's not really that intuitive, the space itself. We are much more accustomed to drawing based on what arguments include, what they say, not what they exclude or do not say. And of course, they are very happy, the test writers, to abuse this logical negative space, much to your detriment. And so you see this on flaws where the answer says something like, the arguer fails to account for/overlooks concept X. And to make matters worse, it's pretty hard to predict where they're going to end up in terms of what they're going to put into that X spot. You also see this on straight-up assumptions where the answer says, the arguer assumes that premise P also accounts for factor X. And just like in the flaw situation, I find it personally pretty difficult to predict exactly what direction they're going to go in terms of X. But over the years, what I've found is that keeping in mind the general form of the assumption, the arguer assumes that P alone is enough to prove C, tends to automatically get you to start seeing the negative space around the assumption without really needing a spot-on prephrase. And the combination of those two things, not needing a prephrase and being sensitive to negative space, I have found to be a helpful tool for the vast majority of people that I've come across who've needed help with assumptions. So that's why I'm teaching it here. So to build up our discussion to eventually reach those harder assumptions and arguments that we're trying to get at, let's start with the basics. The easiest, friendliest arguments run something like this. The premises will say something like blah blah blah, distinct concept P, followed by more blah. And there's also a conclusion that's similarly structured, blah blah blah, but there will be a distinct concept C, followed by more useless text. And so the assumption, of course, which is not written down, this is something that we come up with. The assumption would be structured something like this. It'll be some statement that links the red P with the blue C in the proper fashion. And this, of course, is the basis for my somewhat juvenile RBP method. Start by finding the concept that matters in the premises, put that in red. Find the concept that matters in the conclusion, put that in blue. Next, we prephrase the assumption, when possible, in purple, making sure that it somehow links the red with the blue. I do want to stress that this is a purely instructional method. I do not recommend training yourself to rely on this color coding stuff. I don't even know if it's possible under the ProctorU system that they have. But feel free to apply this RBP methodology to use in untimed practice just to help you get used to breaking down arguments. So what makes these arguments/assumptions so easy is that unique idea P is quite identifiable in the premises, and the unique idea C is very distinct from P. And C, in its own turn, is quite identifiable in the conclusion. So there's a clear separation between the ideas and where they are located. So to give an example of a question that I think demonstrates a pretty clear P versus C dichotomy, we're going to look back again at our old friend, the June 07 exam, section 2, question number 1. This is actually a main point question, but that of course tells us that the stimulus itself is a fully fledged argument. So the premise is relatively straightforward, and you can summarize the premises as saying, productivity efforts sometimes harm dismissed employees and reduce the sense of security for retained employees. The conclusion, in contrast, tells us that productivity efforts sometimes fail to benefit the business as a whole. The assumption then, we are just simply going to try to smash together the red and blue idea in some way that makes sense for us. So for the assumption, I'm going to say that harming dismissed employees and reducing security for retained employees, those facts alone ensure that you have failed to benefit the business as a whole. So you can see echoes of the general form of the assumption very clearly in the way that I formulated the link between red idea and blue idea here. And now the good stuff, negative space. So what am I thinking in terms of negative space? The first question that comes to mind, thanks to the way I've written the assumption, is, really? Isn't it possible, however uncool it feels to think this way, isn't it possible that firing people and scaring the rest will still benefit the business somehow? And again, I'm getting this idea from just reading the assumption. Harming dismissed employees and reducing security for retained employees. Those facts alone ensure that you have failed to benefit the business as a whole. So when I put it that way, these are the kinds of thoughts and questions that come to my mind. So that one was fairly straightforward, but let's dip into a more difficult one here. Sometimes the distinction between the red premise concept and the blue conclusion concept is subtle. It's more of a P versus P plus than a P versus C. So the ideas aren't quite as distinct. They're actually going to be worded very similarly, if not almost identically. And to make matters worse, as the LSAT is very fond of doing, they often combine the subtlety of the P versus P plus thing with putting P in one of the premises and P plus in the other premise, all while giving us a conclusion that doesn't give us a useful C concept distinctly. So let's see how that looks on the other page here. So Prep Test 68, Section 2, Question 2 is what I would consider a fairly egregious example of both of those things at play. And both of those things, again, for your review are, 1, making the P versus P plus disconnect hard to see by making the difference between P and P plus relatively subtle, and putting that disconnect, that P versus P plus disconnect, putting that between the premises only, instead of what we're used to on simpler arguments where it's the premises are mismatched with the conclusion. This time, one premise is going to be mismatched with the other premise, and that's where we're going to find our assumptive disconnect. So let's start with breaking down the argument here. We'll start with the premises. The first bit of information that we get is a definition of the term dumping. there are two parts of this definition. The first one being dumping involves selling something in another country below that something's production cost. Our next premise seems to be a particular example, application, or demonstration of something else that's going on in quote-unquote the real world here. And so the second premise is about people who are selling shrimp, so I'm just going to call them shrimpers, from country F. These folks are selling shrimp in country G below production cost of shrimp in country G. That's what the second premise in totality seems to be saying. The conclusion is fairly straightforward. All it says is that shrimpers from F are in fact dumping. So for the next few slides, even though we're going to be discussing various different concepts, I will start by reproducing this breakdown of the argument for our mutual benefit here. So I run into a problem immediately when trying to do the red, blue, purple thing, and that problem is the conclusion doesn't seem to give me much to tag as a distinct concept C, to put in blue here. So when looking at the conclusion, the idea of dumping, that concept is clearly discussed in the premises, so that doesn't seem like a great place to slap the blue label. And so really the only thing that I see that we can latch onto as perhaps a distinct idea is the claim itself that those shrimpers are, in fact, dumping. And I want to point out here that what I've just described is technically correct from a logical perspective, i.e. labeling the R term in the conclusion as our blue concept. I mean, how useless is that, though? It still leaves us short and asking more questions. Even if we highlight that particular concept as our blue concept, we would still need to figure out what exactly in the premises would tell us that these guys are in fact dumping. And labeling the word R as our C doesn't really help us find the actual assumption or disconnect in this argument. So again, while it's technically correct to maybe put the blue color on that word, it doesn't help. It really doesn't help. So where do we go from here? The first thing I want to teach you guys is that the very fact that the conclusion doesn't give us a helpful C concept is a sign that they put the actual assumptive disconnect inside the premises, as opposed to the usual, more standard putting the division across the premises and the conclusion. So again, the disconnect is not between the premises and the conclusion. The disconnect is inside the premises themselves. So my next step is going to be looking at the multiple premises that we have, and I will attempt to try a red, blue, purple situation therein. And I just realized that I kind of was redundant with attempt to try, but too lazy of an editor, not taking that out. So looking at now a slightly scaled up version of our breakdown, just so it's easier to follow along, I'm going to start by looking at the first piece of the first premise. The definition of dumping that we got there starts off by telling us that dumping involves selling something in another country. Looking down at premise 2, I see that the first part of premise 2 that we found lines up pretty well, almost pretty much exactly, with this first part of the dumping definition. So the dumping definition told us that dumping involves selling something in another country. And we are told that the shrimpers from country F are selling something, shrimp in this case, in country G, and they're not from country G. So they are, in fact, selling something in another country other than their own. This tells me that these two parts of the premises, since they essentially line up, that's not where we are going to find the disconnect. So I'm going to cross them out here as candidates for the disconnect. So now the next place I look is the second part of the dumping definition offered by premise number 1. The other part of dumping, in addition to selling something in another country, involves selling whatever that thing is below production cost. And now when I compare that against the scenario presented in the second premise, I see that the second premise tells us that the shrimpers from country F are not only selling shrimp in another country, country G, they are doing so below the production cost of shrimp in country G. And this is a bit interesting. I've highlighted in country G here in blue because that is different from what we get in the second part of the dumping definition in premise 1. Again, the second part of premise 1 tells us dumping involves selling something below that something's production cost. But the scenario that we get about the shrimpers from country F is that they are selling shrimp in country G below production cost of shrimp in country G. So this in country G part, this blue part here, is something that is not really present in the first premise. Because the first premise just says production cost, period. But here we get an additional sort of rider, below production cost of shrimp in country G. So now I have a problem. I have identified the in-country G part as my blue concept. But what would I contrast that with? What would I attach to that as the red concept from premise 1? And this is where we get into negative space. What's actually happening is that The red part that we need to attach the in-country G, blue part to, is actually the lack of a modifier that's placed behind the concept of production cost in premise 1. So again, the blue part is blue in premise 2 because that was added to what was nominally otherwise identical to what we saw in premise 1. So premise 1's red part that we need to highlight is the lack of a label, and the blue part in premise 2, as we've highlighted here, is that very same additional label that was provided in premise 2. So to help highlight where this negative space idea thing is going to go, I am actually going to pretty much highlight the rest of that premise 2 section in blue. So my blue concept is now below production cost, of shrimp of whatever product in country G is the blue concept. And the red concept from premise 1 is below production cost, period. No additional modifiers. So again, the red concept in premise 1 is simply below production cost, nothing else, below production cost, period. The blue concept in premise 2 is below production cost in country G. And so just to make it a little bit more clear, this red concept is what I've been referring to as our P concept, just normal vanilla P, no additions. And our blue concept down below is going to be our P plus. Again, it's very similar to our vanilla P, but it has just a little additional modifier on it so that it's slightly different. It just has an addition, that plus. And that plus in this case is the in-country G part. And so now with this sort of restructuring and reimagining of the P versus P plus disconnect located directly in the premises, let's see if we can get to an assumption of some kind here. And so now we do have a better shot at making some sense of all of this. So as we've been saying all along, our assumption is going to be something that connects our P concept to our P plus concept. So applying this rubric, it appears that our arguer is assuming that defining dumping as simply selling below production cost also covers scenarios where someone is selling below production cost in X specific location. So again, this format should look kind of familiar to you. This is essentially just the general form of the assumption. We are getting a red P idea, and that is being presented to us as something that is alone, without any further explanation, enough to also cover a slightly differently named scenario. And now that we are armed with all this information, we found our red P, we found our blue P plus, and we've kind of smashed it into a purple sentence or two here. Now to actually try to answer this question. This question actually isn't a standard assumption, strengthen, weaken, or flaw type. This is actually an evaluate type, which is technically pretty new to the exam and arguably distinct from a classic assumption question. That being said, understanding where the argument has gaps and failures is still the key to evaluating any argument, so there's really no point in not doing a breakdown like this. I mean, how else are you going to evaluate an argument unless you know where it has failed or where it has worked? So looking at our choices here, answer choice A clearly fits the bill because it highlights the need to figure out whether or not the definition of production cost includes production cost in X location. That's pretty much exactly what our assumption addresses. The difference between plain old production cost and production cost in X location. We would need to figure out whether or not that is the case in order to figure out if this argument works or not. And that's all the specific questions that I'm going to cover for this particular lesson. In an effort to reduce runtime, I'm not going to include another pre-recorded example or discuss the other answer choices from PT 68 Section 2, Question 2. Also, you may have noticed if you've been following my channel to any degree, the new white equals what I'm saying now and the gray is what I've moved past format results in an absolutely massive slideshow. I'm thinking that it's anywhere from quadruple to sextuple the normal slide volume that forms the basis for all of my other videos. So that's another reason for me to stop here because the file is going to get absolutely enormous. If you do have questions about PT 68 Section 2, Question 2, or any other question that you think is relevant to the subject, even if it's not about the subject, this offer is open for pretty much everything at any time. Please feel free to email me and we can talk about it. And I'd like to just make a note, in case you're feeling like it would be weird to be like the only person to contact me. That's not the case. A number of viewers have taken me up on these offers, and so I would encourage you to not hesitate to do the same. Like I said, the whole reason I made this, even though I did arguably cover this pretty well in a couple of the other larger lessons that I have, is that a lot of people this past week have just inundated my inbox with specific requests for this thing. So I do get feedback through email, and I do try to take into account. That's also why I have sort of a updated format. I've been trying to adjust things to suggestions that I've heard. I haven't been able to find ways to incorporate all of them, and not all of them I would think would benefit the channel much anyway, or at least the video consumption style that there is. Growing the channel is not really a huge concern of mine. But yeah, it's feel free to reach out. I really do appreciate the feedback always, and I always appreciate any real questions, because this is what I do. I do this. Yes, I do get paid for doing it, but I also actually legitimately like doing this because I like helping you guys. My perspective is that, sure, not everybody out there maybe is going to get a 170 plus, but there are a lot of people who could be getting 170s that are not, and I want to, whenever I can, to be the person to help you get there. If you can get that 170, I want to be the one to help you get there. So that brings us to the usual place where I pander to the algorithm. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all that stuff to help the channel. So I did just say on the previous slide that it wasn't the hugest priority to grow the channel, but I do also want to see this grow because I want this to reach more people. I really do think that my perspective is a little bit unique and can help a lot of you guys out there. And it is, I would consider a departure from most of the other pre-recorded material that is much more technique focused. And I'm just here not to teach you, what the right answer is, because any set of explanations can do that. But the challenge that most people have is understanding, how do I get to that point from wherever it is I'm starting? And that's the tough one. That's a tough one, and that's what I like doing. And hopefully my videos have demonstrated that that is my primary focus. But in any event, if you have any questions, if you would like a lesson or any just even a brief discussion, email me. I am always reading that email. So yeah, thanks for coming, and I hope to see you in the next one.